Thatcher had done everything she could to break the power of the unions in Britain. But in 1988, she went to Poland to show her support for the workers' union Solidarity.
You see the process from where you are now to where you want to be.
Strikes in Poland led to Solidarity being allowed to contest a general election in June 1989. This triggered a wave of demonstrations throughout Eastern Europe. In the past, the Soviet Union had used military force to crush democratic movements. But the Soviet Union had a new type of leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, who was committed to glasnost and perestroika. He talked about a third way, a gradual transition to Scandinavian-style social democracy, something between free market capitalism and communism. Gorbachev charmed the public and politicians of the West.
He's a bold, a determined and courageous leader.
Gorbachev stood and watched as one by one the old communist regimes collapsed. At the end of the year, the most famous symbol of the division of Europe came tumbling down. For Friedman and the Chicago boys, a whole new world opened up. In the Soviet Union, Gorbachev was hoping to gradually reform the Russian economy. In 1991, Gorbachev was invited to the G7 summit in London. He was hoping for financial support for his gradual economic reforms. Instead, he was told that unless he embraced radical shock therapy, there would be no aid at all.
That's not a little close.
The next month, there was a coup attempt against him. A group of Communist Party hardliners placed Gorbachev under house arrest in his holiday home in the Crimea. Tanks surrounded the White House, the Russian parliament.
Amid the chaos of street clashes, it was obvious that to reinforce their position, the hardliners would have to resort to violence. Such action between the people and the security forces has not been seen since the early days of the Russian Revolution. By dawn this morning, amid a sea of debris, it was becoming clear that the coup was disintegrating. The Russian parliament building was unscathed, the military had not made their move. Inside, Boris Yeltsin was more powerful than ever.
This was Yeltsin's finest hour. Gorbachev was released and he returned to Moscow, but he had lost much of his power.
Я выражаю признательность за принципиальную позицию россиянам, президенту России Борису Николаевичу Ельцину.
In December 1991, the Soviet Union was dissolved, a profound shock for the Russian people. Yeltsin was now in charge of economic policy for the Russian Federation. The free market came to Russia. There was chaos. The adoption of Chicago school policies in Russia marked the beginning of a new chapter in the free market crusade. It was all shock, no therapy. Despite the public efforts to promote popular capitalism, the reality was a small handful of businessmen made vast fortunes. State industries were sold off at bargain basement prices. The Russian press dubbed Yeltsin's advisors the Chicago boys. Yeltsin's shock therapy meant that in 1992, the average Russian consumed 40% less than in 1991. A third of Russians fell below the poverty line, and wages weren't paid for months.
One expert today predicted 140 million Russians will soon be living below the poverty line.
Corruption was rife. Organised crime boomed. Moscow became the new Wild West. The majority of Russians opposed the Chicago Boys' radical vision for their country. In March 1993, Parliament made a crucial decision. It voted to repeal the special powers it had given to Yeltsin. Yeltsin declared a state of emergency. The Constitutional Court ruled that it was illegal. On September 21st, Yeltsin took the Pinochet option and dissolved Parliament.
Сегодняшнего дня прерывается осуществление законодательной, распорядительной и контрольной функций съезда народных депутатов.
The West threw its weight behind Yeltsin.
We feel that Boris Yeltsin is the best hope for democracy in Russia.
2 days later, Parliament voted to impeach Yeltsin by 636 votes to 2. Thousands of supporters of the Parliament gathered outside the White House and marched on the television station. It looked like the supporters of Parliament were winning. Yeltsin flew back to Moscow from his holiday home. That night, 100 demonstrators were killed as the Yeltsin authorities fought back. On the 4th of October, he ordered troops to storm the White House, shelling the very building he had defended 2 years earlier. Christopher, the US Secretary of State, said, "The United States does not easily support the suspension of parliaments, but these are extraordinary times." Yeltsin now had absolute power. With the advice of his Chicago boys, he ruled through a form of crony capitalism. Even more state industries were sold off, creating a new class of billionaire businessmen with huge political influence, the oligarchs. By 1998, 80% of Russian farms were bankrupt and 70,000 state factories were closed. In 8 years, the number of people living in poverty increased by 72 million. Meanwhile, Moscow would go on to have more billionaires than any other city in the world.